Hello, this is Nakhavali, and you're watching and listening to the Middle East Analitika. On this episode, we speak about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, one of the most powerful armies in the Middle East region. I speak with Eric Loeb, an associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University. His research focuses on the intersection of politics and development in Iran and the Middle East region. Professor Loeb, thank you very much for joining the program.
Thank you for having me.
The IRGC is considered a powerful and influential force in Iran, with a significant role in the country's political and economic spheres. It operates independently of the regular military and is directly controlled by the supreme leader of Iran, currently Ali Khamenei. Would you please provide us with a brief history of this force, how and why it was formed?
Right. So right after or even in the midst of the Iranian Revolution, of course, there's debates on when it starts and when it ends. But in the spring of 1979, in April of 1979, the new revolutionary regime issues an announcement or a decree that they're establishing the Revolutionary Guard, or the IRGC, or Sepah in Persian, as a parallel force to the conventional military. And the mission of the organization, which will, of course, change and evolve over time, is to protect the revolutionary regime from internal and external enemies. And really, at the time, the main motivation of the creation of this force is to, again, to protect the regime, but really because there was a high level of distrust in the conventional military. And really, from 1979 up until the Islamic Republic consolidates power in the 1980s, between 1982 and 1983, you have some coup attempts from within the conventional military. You have, of course, there's a process of purging those who are in reality or even in perception disloyal to the revolutionary regime or to the Islamic Republic. And so while this purging process is happening during 1979 and the early 1980s, you have the creation of this this parallel force that the regime, these new political and religious elites can rely on while this is happening. And of course, you have two things happening. You have you're dealing with a revolution, and you have this new state that's trying to consolidate power internally. And then, of course, shortly afterwards, less than 2 years into this process, you have the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War as well. So, the regime is feeling very vulnerable and wants to be able to rely on this alternative parallel force while these processes are unfolding.
Right. Now let's talk about the other issue, and which is actually right now most of the researchers are talking about. The IRGC has been accused of various activities, including supporting and financing terrorism, providing military aid to various groups in the region, and engaging in cyber attacks and other forms of espionage. In your opinion, is IRGC a terrorist organization?
Well, of course, and I think we're going to get more into this. It's in recent years, during the Trump administration, I believe somewhere, of course, in 2018, the Trump administration withdraws from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal that the United States signed with Iran, and the P5+1, the rest of them in 2015. And then I believe shortly afterwards, in 2019 or so, or maybe after, I'm not sure of the exact date, the U.S. decides under the Trump administration to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization, as a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO, and be able to expand sanctions against it. And of course, this then culminates in the assassination of the Quds Force Major General Qasem Soleimani, with really heightened tensions between the U.S. And Iran and the IRGC. And so it's really it's a debate in terms of, because terrorism is a subjective term. It's a course I teach. I teach a course on political violence at my university, and we discuss how terrorism could mean a lot of things. It has a lot of different definitions. Even when you look across U.S. different government agencies in the U.S., they have different definitions of what constitutes terrorism, and oftentimes it's really towards non-state actors or quasi-state actors. So I think this designation was exceptional in the sense that it was a designation that involved a state actor, a military actor that was part of a state, that's part of a state. So that made it unusual. And it's also, it's really become politicized and weaponized. So states use this term, whether it's towards other states or even non-state actors, even insurgents operating within their territories and rebels, to delegitimize these actors. And in the case of the United States, to provide added legal justification for expanding sanctions against certain entities. So, again, I'm contextualizing all of this. And at the same time, I'm not going to definitively say whether the IRGC, whether it is or is not a terrorist organization. Again, given the variety of definitions, given the politicization and weaponization of this term, and again, the subjectivity of it as well, and how it's used in the interests of different state and non-state actors. And I would just leave it at that, I think.
Right, right. Also, we know that there were numerous attacks, mostly by the Iranian opposition groups in European countries, pushing these governments to classify the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Why do you think that the European countries hesitate to do so?
Well, one point I want to say also that I forgot to mention is when you look at Iran's military or strategic or defense doctrine, it consists of 4 pillars. Because in your previous question, you had mentioned you had equated in some ways IRGC activities with terrorism, right? So when you look at the actual defense doctrine of the Islamic Republic, and of course, as executed or implemented by the IRGC, there's 4 different pillars. There's number 1, there's proxies in the region and even beyond the region. Number 2, there's Iran's missile program. Number 3, there's cyber warfare. And then number 4, which is gaining increasing attention with the war in Ukraine, is drones, right? And so the Islamic Republic and the IRGC, by extension, are visibly or overtly active in those 4 domains, right? So and unabashedly so. And so as part of, again, Iran's defense doctrine, as part of a mission to establish strategic depth in the region and even beyond. So again, it's questionable and debatable how we want to label those activities, terrorism or not. Getting to your question about the European Union and how the Europeans react, we see a different approach that they take towards or entities that the United States designates as FTOs, or foreign terrorist organizations. The United States tends to do it in a holistic fashion. They tend to do it across the board. The military entities involved or affiliated with an organization, the economic, the social entities, whereas the Europeans take a different approach. And this is something that I've seen not just with Iran and the IRGC, but even with quasi-state actors like Hezbollah, for example. Something, an organization I've researched on the ground in Lebanon. The Europeans are very careful to differentiate, to give themselves flexibility for engagement, and I think to be more pragmatic and perhaps having less domestic pressures. There may be, less constraints that the Europeans face in terms of, as you mentioned, domestic opposition groups or lobbyists. And so what they'll do is they'll designate to, I think, maybe appease the United States to some extent, they'll designate the military entities of these organizations, but they'll be very careful not to designate the political, economic, and social or cultural entities of these organizations. And so as a result, it gives them flexibility to, an opening to work with these organizations at times. For example, working with Hezbollah inside of Lebanon, for in terms of political or social or economic activities, and perhaps working with Iran in certain ways, and other state and non-state or quasi-state actors. So I think we do see a different approach between how the U.S. designates and engages with these actors or doesn't engage with these actors, and how the Europeans do.
Okay, now let's talk about the Iranian economy. We know that the IRGC is heavily involved in the Iranian economy, and actually, this is also reminding me the situation in Egypt. Of course, they have interests in different sectors, including construction, energy, telecommunication, and transportation. But they have their supporters. They have some supporters who are claiming that, they're building the infrastructure of the country, they're helping Iran to safeguard itself from international sanction, and it generates income for the nation. But also there is other side, and many accuse the organization of monopolizing the key industries, corruption, and poor management. What is your opinion about the IRGC's role in the Iranian economy?
Well, I think everything you asked in the question is true, right? These issues are complex, and I think we could see them from both sides. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that there's a debate among analysts, among economists, scholars and analysts who focus on political economy, just how much of a share of the economy the IRGC commands. And so you see all different types of figures, figures on the low side, figures on the high side. It's very difficult, given the lack of transparency, to really unpack this, to really unravel it. And some scholars and analysts have done it more than others. And so that's an open question, I think, that we have to continue to examine, to research. But as you asked, there's of course positives and negatives to the IRGC's economic activities. I mean, the IRGC has become this vast organization, as you mentioned, with its hands in lots of different economic sectors. It's got the political weight of the state behind it. It has a lot of resources at its disposal. It's got high levels of commitment to operate in the Iranian economy. And different levels of competency as well, at different levels, right? But on the flip side, of course, because of these ambiguities that have developed between public and private, between a military entity and an economic entity, as we've seen, like you said, in countries like Egypt, Pakistan, and elsewhere, right? This could give it an unfair advantage, and its proximity to the state, when it negotiates contracts and tenders and bids for them, and creates monopolistic and anti-competitive practices, and then also, of course, gets into the area of corruption and black market and smuggling operations, and even contributes to mismanagement at times of the economy. So I think all of these things are true. I think we could see the positive sides, potentially the negative sides of this. And of course, this in some ways, because of its heavy involvement in the economy, it hurts its legitimacy domestically, right? Among private business people, or people who want to have a bigger share in the market and see the IRGC being obstructionist in this way and being unfair. The other thing too is, of course, because it has such an outsized role, presumably, in the economy, as you mentioned in your question, it will have supporters, even if there's people who maybe are ambivalent about the ideological position of the IRGC. When we talk about patron-client relations and clientelism, there are people who depend on these IRGC entities. Some may even be fronts for the IRGC, but they depend on that for their livelihoods, right? So they're going to supported on those grounds in terms of earning a paycheck and a livelihood for that. So that's how I think we can explain to some extent the level of support that it has inside of Iran.
Right. You mentioned legitimacy. We know that this organization has been criticized by human rights organizations for its roles in suppressing protests and for its wider human rights record. We remember what happened 4 months ago in Iran with the Women Life Freedom Movement. We know that this organization has been accused of using excessive force against protesters, arbitrary arrest, and torture of detainees. Do you believe that the IRGC legitimacy inside Iran would be diminished by these kind of actions?
I do. I mean, of course, supporters of the regime, this will enhance its legitimacy. But for people who are either opposed to the regime or even if they're not demanding regime change, that's going to hurt the legitimacy of the IRGC. I mean, when we look at military entities in different countries of the world, we see a division of labor, right? We see military entities that really their mission is to defend the country from foreign enemies. And as I mentioned, the IRGC's mission is both foreign and domestic enemies, right? So again, whereas you have in other countries a division of labor between the military, which is really largely foreign operations, and then you have domestic security forces and intelligence and police, right, that handle domestic security. Here it becomes conflated with the IRGC that's handling both foreign operations and external security as well as internal security, along with other entities as well. It's not the only one.
Right.
But when it gets involved in that, repression, then that, of course, is going to hurt its legitimacy with particularly people who are demanding reform and who are opposed to the regime.
Let's now move to the larger scale of our discussion. Let's talk about the Middle East. We know that the IRGC plays a significant role in the Middle East, particularly in Iran's effort to expand its influence in the region. We know that the organization has been involved in a range of activities across the Middle East, including military interventions, support for proxy groups, and political and economic initiatives. Do you think that the IRGC was successful in carrying out its agenda, given the current situation in the Middle East?
Well, it's hard to define, success, but I think that I had mentioned those four pillars of the Iranian security doctrine, right? And proxy being one of those four pillars. And so we've seen Iran successfully establish these proxy groups in countries like Lebanon, in countries like, facilitated by the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq and Iraq. In Yemen, in the wake of the Arab Spring and the Civil War, in Syria, in the wake of the Arab Spring and the Civil War there, and gain increasing. Again, it's looked at in different ways. Some people look at it as expanding influence, as being expansionist, as being hegemonic, and others look at it as Iran feeling isolated and having really few allies in the region, and confronting the United States, which has had a very large military presence in the Middle East for many years. And then, of course, many countries, which is somewhat changing, being under the U.S. security umbrella, right? So that Iran, whether it's offensive or defensive, trying to establish strategic depth against the United States and against its regional adversaries. And so I think if we look at it, that over time, and some of it facilitated by things that were not even Iran's doing, again, like the U.S. invasion, occupation of Iraq, the Arab Spring, and these civil wars, the IRGC has taken advantage of these situations and these opportunities to do that and to further this mission.
So I think that the Arab Spring strengthened the IRGC presence in the region.
I think it did. I mean, I would say that I was in Iran during the Arab Spring. I was living there, studying, doing research there. And, the Islamic Republic was very uncomfortable initially with the Arab Spring because they were worried, like many countries in the region, that it was going to spread to their borders. And so and because, particularly because 2 years earlier, they had the Green Movement protests
Right.
that were still continuing through 2010, 2011 to some extent. And so, they were very nervous to see how this was going to go. And so one of the ways that they tried to combat this is they tried to legitimize the Arab Spring through their own framing. And they called it Bidar Islami, the Islamic awakening, to try to kind of co-opt the Arab Spring to their advantage, whether it worked or not. But I think, of course, as I mentioned, given the instability that came with the Arab Spring in countries like Syria and countries like Yemen, the IRGC was able to position itself to further strengthen or even to establish connections, and then to further strengthen the proxies that it had there in its interests. And of course, that also being facilitated in Iraq by the U.S. invasion and occupation, which of course began in 2003. That predated the Arab Spring.
We know that IRGC plays a very important role for regime's internal security. And we remember its role we mentioned the protests in Iran, and we remember the role of IRGC in repressing protests. And of course, this reflects the regime's commitment to upholding the country's political and social order. But also it appears that the government has relatively less authority over this organization. So do you think that the IRGC is above all other Iranian institutions and organizations? And if so,
Well,
why?
I think it's a big question, again, that scholars and analysts are debating. There's some who take the view that the organization is unidirectionally controlled by the supreme leader, as you had mentioned earlier, Ali Khamenei. Is just giving orders and directives to the IRGC. And there's others who say that the IRGC pushes back against the supreme leader, that it's a two-way street, and even other political elites. And that over time, of course, the IRGC has expanded its position in the government, in the economy, in its foreign operations, and that it's gained increasing power. Some would say that its power is disproportionate to other institutions inside the country. And others would take the other view that it is an important actor. And again, I was just looking at an edited volume that Mehran Kamrava had published out of Georgetown University, looking at all the different institutions in the Islamic Republic. There's a constellation of institutions, right, that all have agency and power, and that have different dynamics. At times they cooperate, at times they compete, and so it may be reductionist to say that the IRGC is. Of course, we have to acknowledge its power domestically, regionally, even beyond. But again, we can't neglect or ignore these other institutions inside the country as well, that may at times act as a balance to the IRGC.
Right. Let's talk about the recent developments between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We know that this all happened, of course, mediated by China, although there were many rounds of negotiation before that in the Persian Gulf countries. However, in the end, we see that China was the mediator between these two countries. But how do you think that these developments could affect the IRGC role in the region?
Well, it's going to be very interesting because obviously, particularly since 2016, there's been sources of major tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, these two large powers in the region, putting Israel to the side and some other regional powers like Turkey and others. And so as a result, this created a large role, a prominent role for the IRGC within these tensions, right? And so this culminates, I think, in 2019 with these missile, rocket, and drone attacks on the Saudi oil facilities in Khurais and Abqaiq, which it was a very big deal, and took Saudi oil production and refinement capacity offline for some time. And there were some current concerns in the way that the U.S. responded to that, whether they were giving the Saudis the security guarantees that they wanted. But there are reports that show that the IRGC, whether they were directly or indirectly involved, were somehow involved in such operations. Of course, we also saw attacks on tankers in the Persian Gulf and other operations against Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries. And so if tensions could be dialed down as a result of this and could be reduced or contained, then of course there's still going to be, and this is a big question. The question is, despite the fact that China has mediated this and that talks were already in the works in Iraq and Oman between the Saudis and the Iranians, there's such a history of distrust and suspicion and tension. The question is this agreement going to be sustainable over time? If it's not sustainable over time and we have tensions that reemerge, the IRGC is going to be at the forefront of those tensions in their operations. If there is sustainability and longevity to this agreement and tensions can be dialed down, and I think we just saw that there's a potential agreement between the Saudis and the Houthis in Yemen, and potentially there could be a continuation of a ceasefire there, then we'll see that perhaps the IRGC, the role will be somewhat diminished for them within the framework of these tensions in the region.
Professor Locke, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for watching and listening to us. Please don't forget to subscribe.